Every 4th of July, as Americans, we celebrate the birth of our nation. We picture Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence, and the Founding Fathers. But while history was being written there, another story was unfolding here in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. Long before independence was declared, the people living along the new River and Holston Valley were already being forced to choose a side. Some stood with the colonies. Others remained loyal to the British Crown. Families were divided. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Here in Appalachia, the Revolutionary War wasn't just fought against Britain, it became a war within the frontier itself. And months before the Declaration of Independence, 15 frontier leaders from southwestern Virginia made a decision that could cost them everything. They signed a document declaring they were prepared to live and die for the liberties they believed were worth defending. They had no way of knowing whether history would remember them as patriots or condemn them as traitors, but they were willing to find out. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. And if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. In the winter of 1775, life on Virginia's western frontier was far removed from the political debates taking place in Philadelphia and Williamsburg. Here in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, families were more concerned with surviving another winter than shaping the future of an empire. Most had come here for land, for opportunity, and for a chance to build a better life. Few could have imagined they were about to become part of one of the most important chapters in American history. It wasn't a story of grand meeting halls or crowded city streets. It was a story of small settlements carved from the wilderness, of log cabins standing beside narrow trails, of families who had come here looking for land, opportunity, and a chance to build a better life. Most never imagined they would find themselves caught in a revolution. Imagine you're living here in 1775. You've spent years clearing your land, building your home, and raising your family. Your nearest neighbor may live miles away, but when a barn needs raising or a harvest comes in, everyone helps. You worship together, trade with one another, depend on one another. Then, almost overnight, something begins to change. News arrives from the East that the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies is beginning to fall apart. At first, it feels distant, just another political argument happening in places you've never seen. But with each rider who comes down the Great Wagon Road, with every conversation in a tavern, with every letter read aloud after church, that distant conflict moves a little more closer to home. Soon, people begin asking questions that have no easy answers. Should these colonies remain loyal to King George III, or has the crown pushed too far? Neighbors begin choosing different sides. Friends stop trusting one another. Even families find themselves divided over what should happen next. Long before British soldiers ever marched through these mountains, the Revolution had already arrived. Not with muskets, not with cannon fire, but with a single question that every man and woman on the frontier would eventually have to answer. When the time comes, which side will you choose? As America celebrates its 250th birthday, celebrating the freedoms that make this nation unlike any other, we're going back to the beginning. But not to Philadelphia, but to the Appalachian frontier, where ordinary people faced extraordinary choices and where the story of American independence became deeply personal. This is the story of the Revolutionary War in southwestern Virginia. In 1775, there was no Washington County, no Smith County, no Wythe County. Those names that are so familiar to us today simply didn't exist. Instead, this entire region belonged to a vast stretch of Virginia known as Fincastle County. Created just 3 years earlier in 1772, it was one of the largest counties ever established in colonial America, stretching from the Blue Ridge Mountains west towards the Mississippi River. It was less a county than a frontier, a place where maps were still being drawn and communities were still taking shape. Life here demanded a different kind of person. Most families had arrived by following the Great Wagon Road south through the Shenandoah Valley before turning west into these mountains. Many were Scot-Irish, others were German or English immigrants. They weren't searching for wealth or fame. They were searching for land, a place where they could build a cabin, raise a family, and leave something behind for their children. It wasn't easy. The forests were thick. Roads were little more than narrow trails. Rivers had to be crossed by ferry or forded on horseback. Every tree that stood where a field would one day grow had to be cut by hand. Every cabin had to be built log by log. The nearest town might be a day's ride away. Out here, neighbors depended on one another. When someone built a cabin, the whole community showed up to raise the walls. When a family lost a crop, neighbors shared what little they had. When danger came to the frontier, it wasn't a distant government that answered first. It was the people living next door. But this land wasn't empty. Long before European settlers arrived, Cherokee, Shawnee, and other native people hunted these valleys, traveled these rivers, and called this region home. As more settlers pushed west, conflict over the land became unavoidable. Treaties were signed, boundaries shifted, and violence sometimes followed. The frontier that promised opportunity for one family often meant loss for another. It was a complicated place, one where survival often mattered more than politics, at least in the beginning. Because while the people of Fincastle County were busy clearing fields and building homes, events unfolding hundreds of miles away were beginning to reshape their future. Parliament was passing new laws. Colonists were protesting. Tension with Great Britain grew and grew. At first, those headlines felt like someone else's problem. Most people here had never seen Boston. Many had never been further east than Williamsburg. What happened there seemed a world away from life in these mountains. But history has a way of traveling, sometimes on horseback, sometimes folded inside a letter, sometimes carried by a traveler stopping for the night at a frontier tavern. And before long, the people of southwestern Virginia realized they could no longer remain spectators. The revolution was coming, not first with soldiers, but with a decision. By the winter of 1775, the arguments that had once seemed so far away could no longer be ignored. Word had spread across Virginia that leaders in the capital, Williamsburg, wanted to know where the frontier stood. They needed to know whether the people living west of the Blue Ridge would remain loyal to the crown or stand beside the other colonies if the dispute with Great Britain grew worse. The answer would come from the people who knew the frontier best. Among them was a surveyor named William Preston. If you've ever driven through the New River Valley, you've traveled land that Preston once helped survey. He wasn't just mapping property lines. He was helping mold a growing frontier, settling disputes over land, organizing local government, and serving as a militia officer. His influence reached across much of western Virginia, and people respected his judgment. Farther southwest, near present-day Abingdon, another leader had earned the respect of the people around him. William Campbell wasn't a politician. He wasn't interested in making speeches. He was a soldier, a farmer, and a man his neighbors trusted. When trouble came to the frontier, Campbell was the kind of man others naturally followed. Years later, that quiet confidence would help change the course of the American Revolution. There was William Christian, another experienced militia officer whose connection to Patrick Henry tied the Appalachian frontier directly to the political debates taking place in eastern Virginia. And there was the Reverend Charles Cummings, remembered as the Fighting Parson, a Presbyterian minister who believed that faith and the defense of one's community could go hand in hand. These men came from different backgrounds. Some were farmers, some were soldiers, some preached from the pulpit. Others spent their lives exploring and surveying the wilderness, but they all shared something in common. They loved this frontier. They had built their homes here, raised families here, buried loved ones here. Whatever happened next would affect everything they had worked to build. Early in 1775, they received word that representatives from across Fincastle County were being called together. The purpose wasn't to declare independence, not yet. Instead, they had been asked to answer a simple but dangerous question. Where did the people of southwestern Virginia stand? For 15 men, the answer they gave would become one of the most important moments in our region's history. And once their names were written beneath that answer, there would be no taking them back. No one knows for certain exactly where the meeting took place. Some historians believe the men gathered at the courthouse near the lead mines in what is now Austinville. Others believe they met at Jane McGavick's Tavern near present-day Fort Chiswell, where travelers from across the frontier naturally cross paths. What we do know is that on January 20th, 1775, 15 men from Fincastle County came together to answer a question that would shape the future of southwestern Virginia. They didn't gather to declare independence. That often surprises people. In January of 1775, the idea of separating completely from Great Britain was still difficult for many colonists to imagine. Most of these men had grown up as loyal British subjects. They referred to King George III as their lawful sovereign and hoped the growing crisis could somehow be resolved peacefully. But hope was beginning to give way to reality. Parliament had passed law after law that many Virginians believed violated their rights. Tensions were rising across the colonies, and Virginia's leaders wanted to know where the frontier stood if events continued to spiral toward war. The men of Fincastle County gave their answer. Together, they drafted what became known as the Fincastle Resolutions. The document expressed their loyalty to the king, but it also declared that they believed the people of the colonies possessed certain rights and liberties that could not be simply taken away. If those rights could be restored peacefully, that was the outcome they desired. If not, they declared they would stand with their fellow Virginians in defense of those liberties. Near the end of the document came the words that still echo across 2.5 centuries. The men pledged they were resolved to live and die in defense of their freedoms. Think about what that meant. These weren't anonymous signatures on an old piece of paper. These were men whose neighbors knew where they lived. Men with farms to lose, businesses to protect, wives and children waiting for them at home. If Britain crushed the growing resistance, signing a document like this could easily be viewed as an act of treason. Everything they had built on the frontier could be taken away. Yet, they signed anyway. History often remembers the Declaration of Independence, adopted more than a year later. But here in southwestern Virginia, the people of the frontier had already declared something just as important. They had decided where they stood. What none of them could know now was how quickly that decision would be tested. Within 3 months, shots would be fired at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun, and before long, the choices made around that table would be measured not in words, but in lives. When news of Lexington and Concord finally reached the Virginia frontier, it arrived on horseback. There were no newspapers delivered to every doorstep, no telegraphs, no radios, just riders carrying letters, travelers stopping at taverns, and conversations that spread from one settlement to the next. The shooting had started. The disagreements were over. The colonies and Great Britain were now at war. For the people of southwestern Virginia, that news didn't bring celebration. It brought uncertainty. Until then, many had hoped cooler heads would prevail. They believed Parliament and the colonies might still find a way to settle their differences without bloodshed. Now, that hope was gone. The question was no longer whether there would be a war. The question was what role this frontier would play in it. For some, the answer came easily. They believed the colonies had every right to defend the liberties they believed had been taken from them. Others looked at the same events and reached a very different conclusion. To them, King George III was still their lawful king. Rebellion wasn't patriotism, it was treason. Imagine living in a small settlement where you've known the same families for years. You've shared meals together, helped raise one another's barns, stood beside each other at weddings and funerals. Then one day you discover the man across the creek believes the king is right. Another believes the colonies are. Whose side do you trust? Whose side do you fear? Across the Virginia frontier, those questions became part of everyday life. William Preston later expressed concern that there were way more loyalists than people realized in parts of western Virginia. Men who were organizing and meeting all throughout the region, where men opposed to the patriot cause gathered quietly, away from the watchful eyes. Patriot leaders feared those groups might attempt to seize the valuable lead mines or aid British forces if they reached the frontier. Suspicion became almost as dangerous as the war itself. A stranger riding through after dark, a neighbor asking too many questions, someone who suddenly stopped attending militia musters. Small things that might once have gone unnoticed now carried new meaning. Nobody wanted to accuse the wrong person, but nobody wanted to trust the wrong person either. The Revolutionary War in southwestern Virginia wasn't fought first on a battlefield. It was fought in conversations, in churches, in taverns, across fence lines. It divided communities that had depended on one another for survival. And while no British army had yet marched into these mountains, the Revolution had already arrived. The frontier would never again be the same. By 1776, the people of southwestern Virginia had already chosen their course. Now, they had to live with it. The war that had once seemed so far away was spreading across the colonies. Every month brought new reports of battles, victories, defeats, and growing uncertainty. But while soldiers fought hundreds of miles from the Appalachian frontier, the people here discovered that they had something the Patriot cause desperately needed: resources. Among the most valuable were the lead mines near present-day Austinville. Lead may not sound very important today, but during the Revolution, it was as valuable as gunpowder itself. Every rifle carried by a Patriot militiaman depended on lead for ammunition. Without it, a rifle became little more than a heavy piece of wood and iron. Long before anyone imagined independence, miners had been digging lead from these hills. Welsh miners had been brought to the region for their experience, and much of the hard, dangerous work was carried out by enslaved men whose contributions were rarely recorded in the history books. Among those workers was an enslaved man named Aberdeen. His story isn't nearly as well known as William Campbell or William Preston, but perhaps it should be. Aberdeen escaped from a loyalist owner during the Revolution and eventually found himself working at Chisel's lead mines, helping produce the lead that would become musket balls for the Patriot Army. When the war ended, freedom did not come automatically. Aberdeen petitioned the Virginia General Assembly, arguing that he had served the Patriot cause after escaping a loyalist master. In 1783, Virginia lawmakers passed a law granting Aberdeen his freedom by name. The Revolution had secured the independence of a nation. For Aberdeen, it had also secured the freedom of one man. As the Revolution intensified, the lead produced here became one of Virginia's most important military resources. That made southwestern Virginia more than just another frontier settlement. It made it strategic. Patriot leaders understood that if those mines were lost, the consequences would be felt far beyond the New River Valley. Ammunition would become harder to produce, and the war effort would suffer. Protecting the mines became one of the frontier's most important responsibilities. That responsibility fell largely to men like William Preston and the local militia. While others marched away to fight, someone still had to guard the resources that kept the Patriot cause alive. They watched for signs of loyalist activity, organized local defenses, and worked to ensure that wagons loaded with lead could continue making their way east to support the war effort. The work rarely received headlines. There were no famous paintings showing men standing watch over the lead mines, no monuments celebrating the wagons that rolled out of Austinville. But wars aren't won by battles alone. They're won because someone grows the food, someone forges the horseshoes, someone repairs the rifles, someone mines the lead. The people of southwestern Virginia weren't simply watching the Revolution unfold. They were helping sustain it. And before long, they would do something else. They would leave these mountains behind, shoulder their rifles, and march south under the leadership of a man from Abingdon named William Campbell. The next chapter of their story will be written not here, but on a wooded ridge called Kings Mountain. By autumn of 1780, the Revolutionary War had entered its sixth year. The fighting had shifted south. British commanders believed they could regain control of the colonies by rallying loyalists throughout the Carolinas and Georgia before pushing north into Virginia. For many on the frontier, the war still felt distant. Then came word of Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson was one of Britain's most capable officers, charged with organizing loyalist militia throughout the Carolina backcountry. Confident in his growing strength, he sent a warning to the frontier settlements west of the mountains. If the mountain men did not lay down their arms and stop supporting the Patriot cause, he threatened to cross the mountains, destroy their homes, and hang their leaders. The threat spread quickly. It was repeated in taverns, at church gatherings, around supper tables. For the people of southwestern Virginia, those weren't empty words. If Ferguson crossed the mountains, the war would arrive at their own doorsteps. That was something they could not allow. Among those who understood the danger was Colonel William Campbell of Washington County. Campbell was not a polished politician or a famous general. He was a frontier militia officer. He understood these mountains because he lived among them. He knew the people because they were his neighbors. When the call went out for volunteers, men began making their way towards Abingdon. They didn't come because anyone drafted them. They came because they believed their homes were now in danger. Imagine the scene. Farmers arriving on horseback with long rifles resting across their saddles. Brothers greeting one another before what might be their final journey together. Mothers watching sons disappear down dusty roads. Wives standing quietly in cabin doorways, wondering if this goodbye would be the last. Each man carried what he could. A blanket rolled behind the saddle. A powder horn hanging from his shoulder. A leather pouch filled with lead balls for his rifle. A few days' worth of food. There were no government-issued uniforms. No supply wagons waiting for them. These were ordinary frontiersmen, bringing their own rifles, their own horses, and their own determination. Some gathered supplies at places like the McCorkle store in present-day Pulaski County. Before beginning the march south, joining volunteers from across Virginia and what is now northeastern Tennessee, together they formed a force unlike anything the British expected. History would remember them as the Over Mountain Men. But standing there in Abingdon, at what is now called the Abingdon Muster Grounds, they weren't thinking about history. They were thinking about home. They were thinking about the families they were leaving behind. They were thinking about a threat that had been made against everything they had worked to build. Within days, they would cross the mountains. Within weeks, they would stand face to face with Major Patrick Ferguson. And on a rocky ridge in South Carolina, the people of southwestern Virginia would help fight a battle that many historians believe changed the course of the Revolutionary War in the South. The march south wasn't easy. The Over Mountain Men crossed rugged trails, steep mountain passes, and rivers swollen by autumn rains. They traveled quickly, knowing every day they delayed gave the redcoat Patrick Ferguson another opportunity to strengthen his position. As they moved through the backcountry, more patriot militia joined them. Men from Virginia, men from what is now Tennessee, men from North Carolina. They came from different settlements and different walks of life, but they shared one purpose: stop Ferguson before he brought the war into their homes. And on October 7th, 1780, they found him. Ferguson had chosen a narrow, wooded ridge known as Kings Mountain, just inside present-day South Carolina. Convinced the steep slopes gave him a strong defensive position, he believed no frontier militia could successfully attack him there. It was a costly mistake. The men climbing those hills weren't trained like European soldiers. They hadn't learned to fight shoulder to shoulder in long, straight lines across open fields. They had spent their lives hunting in these mountains. They knew how to move through heavy timber, how to use rocks and trees for cover, how to fire with patience instead of haste. As the patriot militia surrounded Kings Mountain, they advanced from every direction. Whenever Ferguson's loyalists charged downhill with bayonets, the frontiersmen slipped back into the woods, just beyond reach. Then, as the charge lost momentum, they turned, took aim, and climbed again. For more than an hour, the mountain echoed with rifle fire. Smoke drifted through the trees. Commands were shouted above the gunfire. Men fought not for distant cities that they had never seen, but for the homes and families they had left behind. Among those on the mountain were volunteers from southwestern Virginia who had answered William Campbell's call in Abingdon only days before. Campbell himself moved across the battlefield, directing his men as the fighting closed in around Ferguson's position. By the end of the battle, Major Patrick Ferguson had been killed, and his loyalist force surrendered. The victory sent shockwaves throughout the colonies. Many historians consider Kings Mountain the turning point of the Revolutionary War in the South. The defeat forced British General Charles Cornwallis to abandon his immediate plans to push deeper into Carolina backcountry and changed the momentum of the Southern campaign. From that point forward, Patriot fortunes in the South steadily improved, leading ultimately to the victory at Yorktown just over a year later. The men who had marched from southwestern Virginia returned home changed. Some carried wounds that would never fully heal. Others carried memories that would never speak about. All of them knew they had been part of something much larger than themselves. They had left home as farmers, blacksmiths, millers, ferrymen, and hunters. They returned knowing that they had helped write one of the most important chapters in the fight for American independence. And although history often remembers the famous names of the Revolution, the road to victory also passed through the mountains of southwestern Virginia, carried on the shoulders of ordinary people who believed some things were worth defending. And one of the men who never came home was Lieutenant Rees Bowen of present-day Tazewell County. Killed during the fighting, his sacrifice became part of the growing legacy of Southwest Virginia's role in the Revolution. The war officially ended in 1783. After 8 long years, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. The celebrations that followed were undoubtedly joyful. But here in southwestern Virginia, life had to go on. Fields still needed planting, cabins still needed repairing, children still needed raising. And neighbors who had stood on opposite sides of the Revolution had to find a way to live beside one another once again. Not every wound left by the war could be seen. Some families had lost fathers and sons. Some loyalists left homes behind, never to return. For many Cherokee communities, the end of the Revolution did not bring peace, but continued pressure as settlers pushed farther west into the lands they had called home for generations. For enslaved men and women, the promises of liberty celebrated across the new nation remained painfully out of reach. Another remarkable story unfolded here in southwestern Virginia. According to local tradition, while Rees Bowen and many of the other men were away fighting during the Revolutionary War, his wife, Margaret Lavisa Bowen, found herself helping defend Maiden Spring Fort in what is now Tazewell County, Virginia. When word spread that native warriors had been seen moving through the woods surrounding the fort, she refused to let it appear undefended. Lavisa, dressed in her husband's clothes, shouldered a musket, and with the help of another woman carrying a broomstick fashioned to resemble a rifle, the two spent the night patrolling the walls of the stockade. To anyone watching from the darkness beyond the trees, it appeared the fort was still guarded by armed men, discouraging any attack and protecting those inside through nothing more than Lavisa's quick thinking and determination. Some even say that after discovering how practical her husband's trousers were, Lavisa never wore another dress again. History is rarely simple. It never has been. But neither should we forget the courage it took for ordinary people to make extraordinary decisions when the future was anything but certain. Today, if you travel to Smith County, Virginia, you can visit Aspenvale Cemetery. It's a peaceful place, the kind of place you could easily drive past without realizing the history resting beneath its trees. There you'll find the grave of Colonel William Campbell. He wasn't a president. He never signed the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't a household name then, and for many Americans, he isn't one today. But when his neighbors answered the call in Abingdon and followed him over the mountains, they helped win a battle that some historians believe changed the course of the Revolutionary War in the South. Not far away, the old lead mines near Austinville remind us that these mountains supplied more than brave men. They supplied the lead that armed the Revolution. And scattered across southwestern Virginia are the names of Preston, Christian, Cummings, Ingalls, Cloyd, Paris, and countless others whose stories deserve to be remembered, not because they were famous, but because they were ours. Now, before we close out this episode, I need to extend a special thank you to April Martin, historian with the Wilderness Road Regional Museum, for sharing her time and expertise while helping me research this episode. If you'd like to learn more, I highly recommend the PBS documentary, Resolve to Live and Die, The Revolutionary Roots of Southwest Virginia. It's available on the PBS website, and you can also check with the Wilderness Road Museum for upcoming screenings throughout southwestern Virginia. As America celebrates 250 years of independence, most of us think of places like Boston, Philadelphia, Lexington, and Concord as the birthplace of the Revolution. But here, in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, some believe another chapter of that story had already begun. Months before the Declaration of Independence, months before Thomas Jefferson put a pen on paper, and months before the first shots at Lexington and Concord, 15 men from Fincastle County present-day southwestern Virginia, signed a document declaring they were prepared to live and die, defending the liberties they believed belonged to them. Did the American Revolution begin in southwestern Virginia? History may never give us a definitive answer, but one thing is certain. Long before the smoke cleared at Yorktown, long before America celebrated its first Independence Day, the people of these mountains had already made their choice, and they were willing to live and die for it. Thank you for listening to Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider following the podcast and leaving a review. It really does help others discover these Appalachian stories. Until next time, I'm Kevin Austin, and remember, every root tells a story, and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.